Imagine if the government didn't just shut down your business, but they took the unprecedented step of legally banning your family's last name from ever being spoken on a stage.
Right. Just completely erasing your identity from the industry you built.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today, for you listening at home, is to really explore the incredible, chaotic rise and fall of Minskys burlesque.
We're going to be looking closely at their empire from roughly 1912 to 1937.
Yeah, and we are pulling all of our insights today from a highly detailed historical breakdown of the Minsky family and the entire burlesque industry that they practically reinvented.
And this really isn't just a story about risque dancing.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
At its core, this is an absolute masterclass in business pivoting. It's a look at the intense push and pull of censorship and a wild example of how a massive logistical inconvenience accidentally revolutionized American entertainment.
What's really fascinating here is how these four brothers, Abe, Billy, Herbert, and Morton Minsky, how they navigated the incredibly strict societal rules of their time.
Right.
Because the historical record shows that while their shows were ultimately declared obscene and outlawed, they were, by modern standards, actually rather tame.
Very tame.
But to understand how they built their empire, we have to look at the incredibly restrictive environment they were operating in and the physical constraints they were dealing with from day one.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the origins of this whole empire are just so chaotic. It all starts in 1908 with the eldest brother, Abe.
Right.
He launches this business on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, running a Nickelodeon that apparently showed some pretty racy films for the era.
Huh.
Now, I know the word Nickelodeon from the kids' TV network, but what exactly was that in the context of early 1900s New York?
Well, in those days, a Nickelodeon was essentially the very first type of indoor exhibition space dedicated to showing projected motion pictures.
Okay.
They were usually just converted storefronts. You paid a nickel, hence the name, and you sat on a hard wooden chair to watch a series of short, silent films.
Just a nickel.
Yeah, they were incredibly popular, incredibly cheap, and they often operated in a bit of a legal gray area regarding content.
Which explains why Abe gets shut down. But the wild part is, it wasn't the city or the police who shut him down.
No.
It was his own father. His dad actually forces him to close the Nickelodeon, but then turns around, buys the National Winter Garden Theater on Houston Street, and hands the venue over to Abe, along with two of his brothers, Billy and Herbert.
It is a very classic, heavy-handed family business dynamic.
Yeah, seriously.
But the father's gift came with a massive structural flaw. The National Winter Garden Theater was inconveniently located on the 6th floor of the building.
The 6th floor.
Yes. And in the early 1900s, getting audiences to climb 6 flights of stairs for a show is a tremendous logistical hurdle. Elevators were not a standard luxury for these types of venues.
So they have this venue, but they have a massive business dilemma. I mean, at first they try showing respectable films, but they quickly realize they just can't compete with a large, established theater chain.
Right, the big chains had all the leverage.
So then they pivot to vaudeville, bringing in live acts. But they hit another wall. They simply cannot afford the top-tier vaudeville acts that would actually convince people to make that exhausting 6-story climb.
They needed a product that was economical to produce, but possessed a dedicated built-in audience. So they considered burlesque.
Makes sense.
From a pure business perspective, burlesque acts were significantly cheaper to book. At the time, the industry was dominated by these massive circuits known as wheels. You had the Columbia wheel, the American wheel, and later in the 1920s, the Mutual wheel.
How exactly did those wheels operate? Were they like a modern franchise?
Very much so. If a theater owner signed a contract with a wheel, that circuit supplied a brand new, fully packaged show every single week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they provide the cast, the costumes, the scenery, the scripts, everything. It was a turnkey entertainment solution. You just provided the building and took your cut of the door.
That sounds incredibly convenient, especially for guys struggling to fill a 6th-floor walk-up. But they don't take the deal.
No, they don't.
They decide to go totally independent and stage their own shows. I know part of that was to save money, but the research highlights that Billy Minsky had these grand, almost theatrical delusions of grandeur.
He really did.
He longed to be the next Florence Ziegfeld, the legendary Broadway impresario behind the Ziegfeld Follies. He wanted complete creative control.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about it. You have entrepreneurs who want absolute control over their product, operating in a cheaper, independent lane. But they still have that glaring physical problem.
The stairs.
The stairs. How do you get patrons to walk up 6 flights?
Yeah.
Need an overwhelming differentiator, something they literally cannot see anywhere else in the city.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Abe Minsky had traveled to Paris a few years prior. He had seen the Folies Bergère and the Moulin Rouge.
Right, world-famous venues.
Yeah, famous for their avant-garde stage design. So he suggests importing one of their trademark architectural features.
A runway.
Yeah, a physical platform that extends out from the stage, right over the seats, and right into the middle of the audience. They completely reconfigure the theater. And the Minskys literally become the very first to feature a runway in the United States.
It was a brilliant spatial solution. It broke the traditional proscenium barrier between the performer and the audience. And just to make sure everyone walking past that building knew exactly what they were selling, Billy changed the sign out front.
What did it say?
It read, "Burlesque as you like it, not a family show."
That is such a brazen piece of marketing.
It completely reframed the physical limitation of the building. Think about how physical limitations in business often force the most enduring innovations. I mean, the runway is a staple of fashion and performance today, and in the U.S., it traces right back to 4 brothers trying to convince New Yorkers that walking up 6 flights of stairs was worth the effort.
And it worked. The crowds actually started climbing those stairs. But as with any disruptive business, they hit some turbulence.
Yeah.
And that brings us to an accidental moment on stage that practically built their empire.
A pivotal moment.
Yeah, it's 1917. A performer named Mae Dix is finishing her act. She absentmindedly begins removing her costume before she actually reaches the wings, right in full view of the audience.
Right.
And the crowd goes absolutely wild. Hearing this massive reaction, Dix just returns to the stage and continues removing her clothing to wild applause.
It was an entirely unscripted moment. But Billy Minsky, standing in the back and seeing the audience's visceral reaction, immediately recognizes the commercial value.
Of course he does.
He ordered that specific accident to be repeated every single night. And that single decision locked them into an incredibly complex, high-stakes business cycle.
A constant calibration of risk.
Precisely. To keep their operating license, the city required the Minskys to keep their shows relatively clean. But to keep drawing those massive crowds and paying the bills, they had to be risque. Whenever they pushed the boundaries too far to boost ticket sales, the police would raid the theater.
Let's talk about the economics of that controversy, because the numbers they were pulling in were staggering. Let's fast forward a bit to 1924. The youngest brother, Morton Minsky, finally joins the family company after graduating from New York University. He starts managing the Little Apollo Theater up on 125th Street. And talk about an initiation, there's a police raid during his very first show.
What a welcome to the family business.
Right. But for the next 4 years, that theater showed a weekly profit of $20,000. Now, $20,000 a week in the 1920s is massive.
Huge.
But our source materials point out this was $20,000 a week after payola. Who exactly were they paying off?
Payola, in this context, refers to the systemic bribery of local officials, beat cops, and vice squads.
Ah, okay.
Operating a business that constantly flirted with obscenity laws in Tammany Hall-era New York required a massive slush fund. They were essentially paying a shadow tax to keep the doors open and ensure that when raids did happen, they were often tipped off in advance.
Or the consequences were just minimized.
Exactly. Generating 20 grand a week in pure profit after satisfying that network of corruption highlights exactly why they were willing to endure the constant legal harassment. The margins were simply too high to walk away from.
Though the magic didn't work everywhere. Billy attempted to present a so-called classy version of burlesque at the Park Theater on Columbus Circle, and it failed miserably.
It was a total flop.
The audience didn't want polished and polite. They wanted the edge, the transgression, the danger of a potential raid.
Which brings us to the most infamous raid in their history. By April 1925, the legal landscape had shifted slightly. It was actually permissible for women in shows staged by major producers as well as in burlesque to appear topless, but only under a very specific condition.
What was the condition?
It had to be a static tableau, meaning they could not move a muscle. It had to be presented as classical living art.
A legal loophole based entirely on stillness.
Yes, a very similar rule existed in London burlesque around the same time. The authorities reasoned that if it looked like a museum statue, it was art. If it jiggled, it was obscene.
So a book and a subsequent film called The Night They Raided Minskys highlighted a show at the National Winter Garden, where a performer named Mademoiselle Fifi, who was actually just a woman named Mary Dawson from Pennsylvania, stripped to the waist, And then, crucially, she moved.
Right.
The story goes that this triggered a massive cinematic police raid that changed everything.
This raises an important question about how we evaluate historical sources, especially when dealing with entertainment history where myth-making is baked into the business model.
That's a great point.
We have several conflicting accounts of this 1925 raid. You have the book and film highlighting it as a watershed moment, but then you have Mademoiselle Fifi herself, who explicitly went on the record later to contradict that dramatic account.
Interesting.
Furthermore, theater scholars who have dug into the municipal records severely doubt this particular raid even took place the way it was described.
Yeah, the best perspective on this really comes from Morton Minsky himself. In a memoir he co-wrote, he addresses that specific date in 1925. He basically says the day the book was based on was hardly epical.
He played it down.
He wrote that the raid story was fun for Hollywood, but the reality was that raids were simply one of dozens they had become accustomed to. To him, it was certainly no big crisis.
It's a wonderful reality check from the man who was actually balancing the books. To Morton, a raid wasn't a cinematic climax. It was an operational hazard that they had fully priced into their business model.
It was just a Tuesday. And business was absolutely booming, especially as they moved deep into Prohibition. Now, you might assume that this was just a gritty underground scene for a very specific type of rough-around-the-edges patrons.
Sure.
But the National Winter Garden's notoriety grew so much that it started experiencing massive cultural crossover. We are talking about high society elites.
Yes, clientele shifted.
Regular patrons included Condé Nast, the legendary publisher, writers like John Dos Passos and Robert Benchley, the drama critic George J. Nathan, even the poet Hart Crane, who wrote a poem literally titled National Winter Garden in his famous collection, The Bridge.
It became a destination for the intellectual and cultural elite. They were likely drawn to the raw, unpretentious energy of the shows.
A real contrast to their normal lives.
Exactly. It served as a counterculture experience, a place to let off steam during the puritanical restrictions of Prohibition. Slumming it at Minskys became a badge of honor for the Manhattan intelligentsia. But the macroeconomic environment was about to shift drastically.
Right, the Great Depression. You would think an economic collapse of that magnitude would wipe out a luxury like entertainment. But while the Depression devastated so many industries, it actually solidified the Minsky empire. How did they survive when legitimate theaters were going under?
If we look at the mechanics of why that happened, it all comes down to overhead. When the Depression hit, those large, respectable burlesque wheels we discussed earlier, the Columbia and Mutual circuits, completely collapsed under their own weight.
Oh, because they were too big.
Maintaining massive touring productions with centralized costume and set departments became financially impossible. They couldn't sustain the overhead. This massive structural failure left Minsky's independent, lower-cost model as the absolute standard bearer for stock burlesque.
And suddenly they had a monopoly on the talent pool, too. There was a massive supply of unemployed women who desperately needed steady work to support their families. They flocked to the Minskys.
Yes.
And the wages were incredible for the era. Many of these women, some who began in their teens, were making between $700 and $2,000 a week.
That is life-changing money during the height of the Depression. And because they were flush with cash and talent, the Minskys began expanding rapidly. They leased the Harlem Opera House in 1924, and then Hertig and Siemens Apollo in 1928.
But the real gamble, the crowning achievement, happens in 1931. Broadway theaters are closing left and right because nobody can afford legitimate theater tickets.
Right.
Billy Minsky sees the opportunity of a lifetime. He brings the Minsky brand right to the heart of Broadway. He leases the Republic Theater on 42nd Street, staging their first show there on February 12th.
It was a brilliant strategic move. Billy realized that while burlesque itself could not be considered classy by the theatrical establishment, it absolutely could be presented in classy surroundings. By placing it on Broadway, inside a beautiful, legitimate theater, he elevated the perception of the product.
And he proved it. The Republic Theater became Minsky's flagship and the undisputed capital of burlesque in the United States. Today, that theater is actually called the New Victory and specializes in children's entertainment, which is just a wild historical pivot.
That really is a contrast.
But back then, the Minskys inspired a whole wave of other burlesque shows to open on 42nd Street. By the time they finished expanding, the Minskys controlled over a dozen theaters across multiple states. They essentially formed their own wheel.
They stepped into the vacuum left by the older circuits and built an empire on affordable, provocative entertainment during the darkest economic days of the country.
And we have to talk about the talent that came out of those theaters. The sheer volume of legendary performers that used Minskys as an incubator is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Yes, they had headlining strippers like Gypsy Rose Lee and Choreo and Sherry Britton, but Minskys was also a crucible for American comedy. It was a training ground.
The comedy and the stripping were entirely symbiotic.
How so?
The comedians provided the necessary pacing and relief between the burlesque numbers. The crowds could be rowdy, and it took an incredibly skilled comic to hold their attention.
And look at who was holding that attention. I was looking at the notes for this deep dive, and the roster of comics who worked there reads like a Hall of Fame. Phil Silvers was their house comic for nearly a decade. You had guys like Zero Mostel.
Red Skelton developed his timing there.
Wait, Red Skelton.
Yeah.
And I saw Abbott and Costello on that list, too.
Right.
They started in a Minsky burlesque show.
They did, along with Danny Kaye and Jack Albertson. The Minskys demanded top-tier comedic talent because they understood the psychology of their audience. And they were very clear about the artistry involved in the striptease itself, too. It wasn't just a crude display. They emphasized that a good striptease dance required knowing exactly the right psychological moment to remove each garment. As the brothers put it, it wasn't just a matter of going on the stage and taking off clothes. It needed finesse.
It needs finesse. I love that.
Yeah.
But of course, when you are operating 14 burlesque theaters and the competition is fierce, you are constantly pushing limits. Every year, license commissioners would issue new restrictions.
Naturally.
But because actual criminal convictions were incredibly rare, theater managers essentially ignored the warnings. They saw no need to tone down their shows.
Which sets the stage for a massive societal backlash. In 1935, irate citizens groups began heavily organizing and calling for action against burlesque. The mayor of New York at the time, Fiorello LaGuardia, officially deemed burlesque a corrupting moral influence.
He went right after them.
He was determined to clean up the city's image.
The pressure was mounting. The city's license commissioner, a man named Paul Moss, actively tried to revoke Minsky's operating license. But the State Court of Appeals stepped in and ruled that Moss did not have the legal grounds to do so without an actual criminal conviction.
Right. They needed a smoking gun.
Exactly. And in April 1937, they finally got it.
It all came down to a single garment. A stripper performing at Abe Minsky's New Gotham Theater in Harlem was spotted working without a G-string.
The fatal G-string. That single missing piece of clothing triggered a raid that finally stuck. It led to a criminal conviction, and that conviction handed Commissioner Moss exactly what he needed.
The leverage he was looking for.
He instantly revoked Abe's license and then went a massive step further. He flatly refused to renew all of the other burlesque licenses in New York. The entire industry was paralyzed overnight.
The erasure was swift and devastating. After several frantic appeals, the Minskys and their rivals were told they could reopen, but only if they adhered to draconian new rules that completely forbade strippers.
But you can't sell burlesque without the burlesque. Business under the new sanitized code was absolutely terrible, so bad that many New York burlesque theaters were forced to close their doors forever.
It ruined them.
And to put the final nail in the coffin, by the time Mayor LaGuardia was successfully reelected, the actual word burlesque had been legally banned from theater marquees. And soon after that, the name Minsky itself was banned because the government determined the two words were completely synonymous.
Incredible.
Just like that, burlesque and the Minskys were entirely finished in New York City.
It is a remarkable example of state power completely dismantling a thriving cultural and economic empire. They didn't just shut down the theaters, they erased the vocabulary.
It is a heavy ending for the Founding Brothers. But there's an epilogue here, and it's a story that really brightens the mood. It involves Harold Minsky, who was Abe's adopted son.
Right, the next generation.
While the ban wiped out the traditional empire, Harold stayed incredibly active in the business, and he had a massive heart. During the height of the Great Depression, when Harold was just 19 years old, he had taken over operations of the Gaiety Theater in Times Square from his father.
Historical accounts note a very touching detail about how he managed the Gaiety. Every summer, his parents would go to Europe for vacation. Normally, the theaters would close entirely because the heat in New York City was unbearable, and theaters back then were not air-conditioned.
Imagine a packed theater in August in New York with no AC. It sounds like a nightmare.
Brutal.
But the performers literally begged Harold to keep the doors open. The girls were completely broke, and they desperately needed the performance money just to survive the summer.
Yeah.
So Harold agrees.
He kept it going.
He keeps the theater open through the sweltering heat. He charges just a dime for a ticket so people could afford to come. And according to his wife, Darty Minsky, By doing this, he supposedly made over $1 million.
He built immense loyalty among the performers. Throughout the 1930s and into the 50s, Harold discovered and groomed dozens of famous names. He claimed to have discovered future headliner Sherry Britton when she auditioned at just 14 years old.
Wow, fortune.
He also employed and nurtured first-rate comic talents. He doubly understood the formula his father and uncles had perfected.
And he takes that exact formula to the desert. In 1956, Harold takes the Minsky name, which was banned in New York, remember? And he brings it to Las Vegas. He launches a massive revue at the Dunes Hotel.
A perfect fit for Vegas.
Lou Costello, after splitting with Bud Abbott, actually appeared in the 1958 edition of that revue. Harold kept the entire Minsky DNA intact. Chorus lines, top-rate comedians, a snazzy band, and of course the strippers.
If we connect this to the broader evolution of American entertainment, Harold Minsky fundamentally shaped the future of Las Vegas casino entertainment. That review ran for 6 years at the Dunes and then moved to other landmark casinos like the Silver Slipper, the Thunderbird, and the Aladdin.
He built the template.
He absolutely did. He institutionalized the exact blend of comedy, music, and provocation that Las Vegas is still globally known for today. Harold resided in Las Vegas running these shows until his death in 1977.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from a sweaty, inconvenient 6th-floor walk-up theater on Houston Street to the bright lights of Broadway, through an aggressive government ban that outlawed a family's name, all the way to laying the foundational blueprint for Las Vegas revue shows.
It really proves that innovation almost always stems from the fringes.
Yeah.
The lowbrow entertainment of yesterday, the shows that are rated, censored, and deemed inappropriate by the establishment, frequently serve as the critical incubators for the legendary comedic and theatrical talent of tomorrow. The Minskys didn't just sell scandal, they funded the development of modern American comedy and stagecraft.
It's been an incredible journey through the source material today. I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over. Think about the entertainment you consume. If the name Minsky was literally banned by the government for being entirely synonymous with obscenity in the 1930s, only for their exact style of show to become the totally standard, accepted form of entertainment in Las Vegas, shortly after what completely normal form of entertainment that you consume today might be viewed as wildly scandalous a century from now, or vice versa.
That's a fascinating question.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.